To the Justin Strawn Podcast. Glad to be back with you, recording on a Thursday morning. Hope you are having a good week wherever it is that you are. Hope that everything has worked out for you in terms of work, school, life, whatever it may be. Got a good show lined up for you today. We got a lot to talk about, whether or not you're a Mississippi State fan or if you're a fan of some of the entertainment stuff that's going on. We'll talk a little bit about Mississippi State's lost last night to the Texas A&M Aggies. They end up losing the game 88-68. We'll discuss that. We'll also get into some of the portal issues regarding Mississippi State and their attempts to land Jordan Seaton and what it might have cost them in their pursuit of Jordan Seaton. So we'll be discussing that as well. And also we'll be going into some talk about the Night of the Seven Kingdoms on HBO. It's the new Game of Thrones spinoff show. So we got a lot to talk about. Just a reminder, I will try to do better on, it's probably going to be a little while before I get these audio fixed on the podcast. My mic is not working. I don't know why. I think I've got to get some new equipment to attach it to my computer. And unfortunately, the podcast is not monetized at this point. So I'm going to have to wait and do that at another time. But the one thing is, if you're listening to this in the podcast catchers, or if you're listening on YouTube, the software that I use to actually upload podcasts, it does a pretty good job of cleaning up the audio. So it probably sounds better if you're not listening to this live, which I know most of the folks who get this show don't get the live version. So like I said, I got a lot to talk about. So we will go ahead and get into this thing. All right. First and foremost, let's talk about Mississippi State basketball, because this might be the last time that I've talked about the Mississippi State basketball team for a little while, at least for the men's team. Maybe if the women's team can continue to build upon their win against the Kentucky Wildcats, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about them in the future. But as of right now, I'm probably going to end up spending less time talking about the Mississippi State men's basketball team. Any hopes of getting the NCAA tournament are just about gone at this point. I said this team needed to have probably a 11-7, 12-6 type record in SEC play after they got off to such a rough start in conference play. If they wanted to have any in non-conference play, if they want to have any hope at getting to the NCAA tournament, and those first two games of the conference portion of the schedule look good. Mississippi State ends up beating Texas in overtime. They take Oklahoma down at home in pretty convincing fashion the very next game. And so there was a lot of hope. Mississippi State had won 6 games. We thought maybe this team was coming together. They were pulling it. They had rebounded. They were coming together as a team. And now they have lost 4 games in a row. And this most recent loss on the road to Texas A&M, they really weren't even competitive. They kind of hung around for a little while in the first half. Texas A&M started to pull away towards the end of the second half. And then, towards the end of the first half, and then at the start of the second half, Texas A&M just completely pulls away. There were a couple of times when it looks like Mississippi State might have ended up trying to possibly get back in the game, but they never do. And it's honestly the same thing that we've been talking about for this Mississippi State basketball team since the season started. Chris Jans still doesn't know who he can count on outside of Josh Hubbard. Josh Hubbard didn't even have a great game last night, and that's 2 in a row for him. But he's still playing with the lineups. He ends up sitting Jaden Epps. He puts Jamari and Fleming Davis in the starting lineup, which is probably something that could have been done a lot sooner. But he doesn't really – even he didn't do very well when he was inserted into the starting lineup. It just was not a good game. Mississippi State is, like I said, they are reeling. They are probably not going to make it to the NCAA tournament. It's pretty much a foregone conclusion at this point that they're not going to make it to the NCAA tournament. And I would expect for there to be some pretty significant changes going into the 2026-27 season. I have not said – one thing I said on the podcast on Tuesday was I'm not going to be calling for Chris Jans' job. I don't think that's something that we need to explore at this point. He's earned the trust to try to get this thing turned around. But how confident are Mississippi State fans that he can actually do it, because in this day and age, you've got to be successful in the portal. And that's the one area that Chris James has not done incredibly well. He's brought in a couple of players the last couple of years to try to get this, try to get the team over the hump of basically being a middle tier NCAA tournament team. And every portal edition that he's brought in has not panned out. This year, he's had to rely almost exclusively on the portal. And most of the team is comprised of portal players outside of Josh Hubbard and Sean Jones Jr. And unfortunately, we're seeing the results of the fact that Chris James just doesn't seem to have a whole lot of success in the portal. Now, part of it could just be the fact that of the way that Chris James coaches and the way that his system works. He's a tough, defensive-minded coach. He requires a lot from his players, and it takes time for these things to come together. It takes time for these things to gel together as a team, to become more cohesive as a unit. And that's hard to do in the portal. You need guys who can come in and make immediate impact, and that's hard to do with what Chris James does and his system that he employs through the portal. Like I said, I don't think you get rid of him this year. I think you at least let him try to fix it one more year, but you can't. And then we talked about this when we talked about Jeff Levy in football. You can't allow this team to just be bad for an extended period of time. It took forever after Rick Stansbury was let go and then Rick Ray was brought in for Mississippi State to get back into basketball. Even when they hired Ben Howland, people still were not excited about the basketball team. And it didn't ever happen until Chris Jans showed up and started convincing people that this team was worth putting effort into. So, like I said, I'm very discouraged by the way the basketball team has played. I love Mississippi State basketball. It's really my favorite part of Mississippi State athletics, and it really stinks that since 2012 we haven't had a whole lot of success to be just real proud of. Being a kid from the 90s, the team that had the most success was that 1995 team and that 1996 basketball team, the team that ended up going to the Final Four. And because of that, I've just been a huge basketball fan for the most part, and it's been rough to watch these last basically 14 years, I guess, now that we're going on, that Mississippi State just has not been really successful in basketball. They had their best year was in 2019 when Mississippi State ended up being the number 5 seed in their regional and the NCAA tournament. And then they ended up getting bounced in the first round by Liberty. So it's just not been a lot of fun. I'm hoping and praying that he can get this thing fixed, but my confidence level in him to do so next year is waning. It really is. I just don't know that there are just some coaches that don't really do that well in the portal era and the NIL era of college basketball. A team that's very similar to Mississippi State, Anthony Hardaway, who is the coach at Memphis, when he's a player getter. He could go and get him players. But now that the portal era is here, the NIL era is here, he has not had as much success because of what he doesn't necessarily translate as well in the portal era. And like I said, there are just some coaches that struggle with this new type of world that we're living in college sports in general. And I'm starting to wonder if that's going to end up being the case for Chris James as well. I hope not. I like Chris James. He's a good dude. He's fun to listen to. He's got a fire and intensity to him that you really have to admire and respect. But right now, it's just not panning out for him. So we'll see if that ends up staying the case or if he can get this thing turned around. Don't know at this point. So let's talk about the portal news in football. The transfer portal has closed. Players can no longer enter the portal. They won't be able to do so again until after the 2026 football season. And for the most part, I think Mississippi State has done a pretty decent job in the portal. They have gotten some help on the offensive line, probably not as much as they want. They got some help at receiver. They got some other additional help on the defensive side of the football. So they've had some success in the portal. And right now, everyone's eyes are turned towards Colorado left tackle Jordan Seaton. He is the most coveted prize that is still available in the transfer portal, and you've got a number of teams that are trying to pursue him. You've got Mississippi State, who has miraculously been involved with this, which nobody really saw coming. And a lot of it is because of the fact that Coach Lodeholt, who is the offensive line coach, he has worked with with Jordan Seaton in the past and has a relationship with him. So that gave Mississippi State I don't say a good chance to get the most coveted offensive lineman in the transfer portal, but it gave them a better chance than you would expect for a team that's only won one SEC game in the past 2 years. The problem that you have is you also have Oregon who's in on it. You have Miami who is in on him. You have LSU who's in on him, and almost everyone expects LSU will be his final destination. And he's asking for a huge price tag. He's asking for like $4 million in NIL money, and Mississippi State has been offering as much as $3 million, as far as I've heard. So they've tried their best to make a competing offer to Jordan Seaton to try to get him in, because it is the biggest area of concern, it is the biggest area of need for Mississippi State is on the offensive line, especially at his position, which is left tackle. Now, my understanding, I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you that I'm some expert on offensive line play and how well they block, how well they don't block. I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you that. But what I am going to try to tell you is what I have been told based off of people who do know that type of stuff, is he's a very average run blocker, but he's an elite pass blocker. And that's more your concern when you're talking about your left tackle. You want your left tackle to be able to protect your quarterback's blind side. And that's what we need for Kamario Taylor next year. We need somebody who can come in and keep him from being hit without him being able to see it from behind. And that's what you want from Jordan Seaton. All of that sounds great. You want to get this guy. He's elite. He's the guy. He's a difference maker for your team. The problem is Javen James, who was a starting offensive lineman for Mississippi State, has now entered the portal as a result and is now going to Alabama. Why is this important? Because one, you're losing an offensive lineman, in which you don't have a whole lot of room to lose a whole lot of offensive linemen. And this is one of the ones that Mississippi State was actually kind of hopeful might be able to show some production and get better and improve in the next few years to come. He's headed to Alabama, and this is a part of what Jeff Levy and his staff just don't do very well. My understanding is one of two things. When Mississippi State went after Jordan Seaton, this upset Javen James, because this was basically where Javen James was supposed to play next year, was at left tackle, and it's basically a sign that they're trying to replace him. Now, my understanding is like I said, one of two things. Either the coaching staff did not talk to Javen James about what his role would be next year if they do get Jordan Seaton, because in all likelihood, they just simply would have moved him to a different position on the offensive line. Or if they did talk to him and he wasn't just real responsive to it, and he didn't respond very well to it, and they still pursued it anyway, even though it was always going to be a long shot to get Jordan Seaton. And this is why I say that Mississippi State staff and Jeff Levy and the rest of the coaching staff have not handled their pursuit of this player well at all. They've got to figure out a better way to handle these types of situations. You can't allow one of the guys that you do kind of have hope for, that he could possibly be a building block on your offensive line. Yes, the offensive line was bad last year. It was really bad last year. But you can't allow him to escape because you're trying to pursue a long shot at the same time. That's just not going to work, and you've got to handle these types of things better. Look, I know a lot of people will say, grow up, man. If there's somebody better than you, then you need to get better and all this type of stuff. Well, guess what? We're talking about 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old players with egos that just doesn't always jive really well with. And especially in this era where people are willing to pay you for certain amounts of dollars, all that type of stuff, none of that is going to fly over really well. You've got to learn how to manage these players and their egos as well. And obviously, Javen James' ego did not handle this real well. And as a result, he is now heading to Alabama. And from what we're hearing is a lot of Alabama people think that he could actually be a positive piece for their offensive line. And if that ends up being the case, that becomes an even bigger indictment on Coach Loadholt and Jeff Levy, because if he could actually be a quality piece for Alabama, which has a much larger, vast reserve of players to choose from to go and get, and Alabama can get something out of him that Mississippi State couldn't, that's a huge indictment on Mississippi State. It really is, because if you let a guy like that who ends up being a productive piece for the Crimson Tide and you let him get away, and he wasn't that good when he was with you, that's a problem. And it just continues to show that this coaching staff just hasn't had it together. Look, I have said this multiple times. I want to be wrong about Jeff Levy. I do. I really want to be wrong about him. I want him to prove me wrong and prove that he is actually capable of putting a team on the field that can compete for a college football playoff spot. That's what I want to see from Jeff Levy. I'm just not convinced that he can do that. And we're getting ready. I don't know when the expansion will take place, but it's going to expand. It will expand to either 16 or to 24, but it's going to expand at some point. And the more that it expands, the easier it is to get into. And if you can't even sniff the playoff at some point as the continues to expand, then you've got to move on. And like I said, I'm hoping and praying that I'm incorrect about this and that he's going to right this ship and that the offensive line will be better. The defense should be quite a bit better with the additions that they've made and with adding Zach Arnett to the defensive coordinator position. But right now, I'm just not convinced that Jeff Levy knows what it takes to be a head coach at an SEC program, at least not now at this point. Maybe he will in the future, but at this point, I just don't have the confidence that that's going to take place. Like I said, I hope I'm wrong, but at this point, I'm just not convinced that Jeff Levy is the guy that's going to turn this program around. He's got one more year to prove me wrong, and we'll see if he actually does. Last thing before we move on to some of the entertainment stuff, I do want to talk a little bit about the baseball team. We talked about the preseason rankings. We talked about the preseason expectations. Mississippi State is number 4 in the D1 baseball poll. They're number 3 in the Baseball America poll, and that's all great. It's wonderful. I had somebody, because I posted on TikTok earlier this week, one of my clips talking about them being the number 3 team in the Baseball America poll. And I had a guy, I guess he was a Virginia fan, who came in the comments and said, Virginia was number 2 last year. Good luck. Basically implying, at least my assumption is when I read that yeah, Brian O'Connor, the new head coach for Mississippi State, had a very talented team last year, just like Mississippi State is this year, and they ended up not even making it to the NCAA tournament. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know all the ins and outs about Virginia baseball. I don't. But what I do know is, from what I've read, is that they had some injuries. They had some other things that happened. But this is one of the things that I have been a little concerned about as we've gotten closer to the beginning of this college baseball season, is with the preseason expectations, there is a chance for disappointment. And, like I said, Virginia was the number 2 ranked team in the country last year, and they don't even make it to the NCAA tournament. They were a bubble team. They were being talked about as possibly making it in, but they never quite got there. And that is a concern. I mean, you hope and pray that that's not going to end up being the case. But with as much talent as on this team, as much productivity as they have through the lineup, both in the returning players they have from last year's team and the players they picked up in the portal, especially with some of the better Virginia players they brought in, you feel confident that this team should be at least a regional host, if not a top 8 seed in the NCAA tournament. But preseason expectations, the one thing that does come with them is major disappointment if you don't live up to them. And we have seen that a few times with Mississippi State baseball. We saw it in 2014. Mississippi State was the number 2 or number 3 team coming into the season that year, and they end up making it as a number 2 seed in the Louisiana Lafayette regional. End up having a pretty good SEC season. They went like 18-12 that year, but the problem was they lost so many games in non-conference. They had their resume was not nearly as good as it normally is, and they ended up having to play on the road in the regional. Saw the same thing in 2015. They were a pretty highly ranked team and then ended up being the absolute worst team in the SEC that year. They rebounded very well, won the SEC championship the next year. Then you have 2022, right coming off the national championship, and they end up again being the worst team in the SEC, and they haven't really recovered. Like I said, I think this team is going to be good. I think there's more evidence that this team will live up to at least being close to the expectations. It's hard to live up to a number 3, number 4 preseason ranking. It is. It's hard to do that. But I do think that there's enough talent on this team for that to actually happen. The only thing you worry about are injuries to the pitching staff, because if you start suffering significant injuries to your pitching staff, you start suffering injuries to those guys, and you don't know where you're going to get productivity out of your pitching rotation, then it becomes an issue, and then you have to start just basically outscoring the other team. And this team has the potential to outscore. I mean, there's competition for every starting position with the exception of third base, because Ace Reese has that pretty much sewn up. He's probably the only guy who you don't have to basically say he's going to end up having to rotate or possibly, earn his position. He'll be the only one guy you don't have to worry about that. But anyway, so like I said, yes, to whoever it was that posted that on TikTok the other day, I get it. There's always the possibility that Mississippi State might not live up to expectations. But for every team that doesn't live up to expectations, there's normally two or three that do. So I feel confident that they can, but there is obviously a little concern that they might not. But I feel pretty confident they'll end up living up to those expectations. All right, real quick before I sign off on the day, I want to talk about the newest show on HBO. It comes on Sunday nights. It is I always forget the actual name of it. Let me look it up real quick before A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. I always want to call it Night of the Seven Kingdoms or Tale of the Seven Kingdoms. But it's A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. It is on HBO. It is the most recent spinoff from the Game of Thrones world. And I will say this, I really enjoyed the first episode that we got this past Sunday night. I really liked the two guys who are going to be the leads of it. Peter Claffey plays Sir Duncan. Dexter Soul Ansel plays Egg. I'm very interested in both these characters. I think I was really impressed, obviously, with Sir Duncan. He was the Brendan Fraser. That's who I'm thinking of. He's kind of giving me English Brendan Fraser vibes. I like him a lot. He's this tall, kind of, goofy kind of guy. I really liked his character. I think it's a really well cast role. Uh, Look, I've not read the stories of A Tale of the Seven Kingdoms. I've not read any of those novellas, because that's what this show is going to be based on. I haven't read any of them. I haven't read any of the Song of Ice and Fire books. I haven't read any of those Game of Thrones books, but I saw the entire first Game of Thrones show. I've seen the first two seasons of House of the Dragon. I really enjoyed those. When Ryan Nelson and I started our podcast, the Main Attraction podcast, a few years ago, we had a rating system, and for a while, our highest rating was a Game of Thrones. That's how good we both enjoyed that show. Obviously, that show ended poorly. I'm not going to sit there and try to defend it, but I still love that show. I have more enjoyment out of that show than most other shows that I've watched throughout the course of my lifetime. And this show, what I like about it is it's taking the Game of Thrones lore, it's taking the Game of Thrones setting, and basically saying, we're going to give you something different. And this is, to me, what spinoff should be. House of the Dragon is just more Game of Thrones. That's basically all it is. It's the same types of stories. It's the same types of things. Everybody fighting for the Iron Throne. And that's good, and I enjoy that. But sometimes it's nice to get something a little bit different. When the show began on Sunday night, when I was watching it, and it's at the beginning, and he has been kind of talking about his relationship with the knight who he has been serving has just passed away. One of the things I was watching, you start to see him talking, and you start to hear the Game of Thrones music, dun 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 dun, dun, and you start to hear that, and you're like, all right, we're getting back into it. And they immediately cut to him taking a dump behind a tree. And like I said, I saw that coming. A lot of people were kind of surprised about that. I saw that coming a mile away, because it felt very much like we're going to tease that we're going to do Game of Thrones stuff, but we're not. And that's really what that scene was trying to tell us, the viewer. It's, yes, you are going to be back in the world of Game of Thrones, and you're going to be back in that world that many people love and enjoy and have gotten so used to, and the lore, and all of the families. When we get a Baratheon in this very first episode, so like I said, all of this stuff, but we're going to give you a different take on it. It's much more lighthearted. It has a much more comedic tone. I'm not going to necessarily call it a comedy, but it definitely is going to be a different take on what we have seen from this world so far. It's only 6 episodes long. Every season will be 6 episodes long, or probably every season will be. First episode like 40 minutes. My guess is all of the episodes are going to kind of clock in about that same time frame. So you're not, sitting in front of TV for an hour and 15 minutes like some Game of Thrones episodes were. So, like I said, it's a completely different spin on the Game of Thrones universe. And I think it's a much needed change. We still have House of the Dragon. The third season of that should be coming out. I don't think this year. Maybe this year. I don't remember. It's been a while. I don't remember when the last time we had House of the Dragon. Maybe 2 years ago. But it should be a little bit of time before we get the next season of House of the Dragon. So this is a nice little palate cleanser before we end up getting to that point of House of the Dragon and our love of Game of Thrones. Like I said, I really enjoyed this. I think these two actors, what were their names again? Peter Claffey and Dexter Soul Ansel. I think they're going to work really well together. That's really the challenge of a show like this. You have to put a child actor, Dexter Soul Ansel. I don't know if he's done anything else. He's a child actor. He's very, very young. He's just really small. My guess he's probably 10 or 11 when they shot this, but he looks like he's got a lot of talent. He looks like he's going to be a really good. He's going to play really well off of Sir Duncan. And like the problem that you have with these type shows when you have to rely on a kid actor is they can't always pull through because they're not as seasoned, they're not as talented, they're not as well versed in their craft of acting as adults are. But this kid looks like he's got a really good chance to say I'm the exception to that rule, and I'm very excited to see what they do with these two characters. Look, I feel like it is going to be different. It is a different take on the Game of Thrones that we've had up until this point. But I also think that we'll still get some of the same stuff that we've had. I'm sure there will be plenty of sex. I'm sure there will still be plenty of violence. If you watch the coming up on this season of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms trailer that they did at the end, there's going to be plenty of violence. I mean, this entire show is centered around a jousting tournament. So there's going to be times when there's going to be plenty of fighting and plenty of blood. And I'm pretty certain there is a Targaryen in this. I think that's who we saw in that trailer as well. I think there was Targaryen there, but it doesn't have to always be about claiming the throne. It doesn't have to always be about conquest and domination of your opponent and wiping out potential challenges to the throne, which is what we got so often when we got the original Game of Thrones and what we've gotten here with House of the Dragon as well. It doesn't have to always be about those things. And that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed here about this first episode. One last thing I do want to talk about, though, I forgot about this. There's one other show I want to talk about. That is Hijack. I'm very curious if anybody else enjoyed this first episode of Hijack. The second episode is out today. I'll be real honest. I talked about this last week. I said it was one of the shows I was kind of looking forward to that was coming out, and I did enjoy the first season of it. I thought it was a little absurd at times. I thought they really stretched some believability stuff with it. But when I watched the first episode, I just really was not into it. I really couldn't understand what Idris Elba's character was trying to accomplish. It looked like he knew the train was getting ready to get hijacked, and he wasn't really trying to do anything to stop it. And spoilers for this, if you're planning on watching the second season, and so real quick, if that is the case and you haven't watched it yet, you might want to go ahead and tune out at this point. But when Idris Elba reveals at the end that he's the one hijacking the train, I was just like, really? I don't know that this is going to work. One of the things I said last week when I was talking about my excitement for it was I didn't really know how they could get a second season out of this show, especially with Idris Elba at the helm, unless you were doing a show where you end up having just a completely different hijacking around a separate set of characters, and it becomes more of a legacy show more so than it is just a straight second season. It worked, I think, but I'm not sure what they're doing with this. I think this show is going to end up being a case of going to the well one too many times. And right now, I'm very confused by this. I just was not really that into the first episode. And once they make the reveal at the very end about where Idris Elba's character says, I'm hijacking this train, I was like, okay, I don't know that this is going to work. And I looked at some of the reviews for it after I watched the first episode. It's been very mixed, and I'm kind of right there with them. I'm hoping that they can get this, that they'll be able to do better in the episodes to come, but I'm just not sure that I like the premise at all, to be perfectly honest with you. And if you don't like the premise, then I don't know that that's going to work at all as a show. I'm going to try to get a few more episodes and see if it works, but if it doesn't, I'm probably going to tap out after a few episodes. All right, one last thing. I keep forgetting there's other things I want to talk about. The show industry. The fourth season started a couple weeks ago, and I've heard so many wonderful things about the show. I started trying to watch it a few years ago when the first or second season was out. I don't know when exactly, but I tried getting into the show when it was first getting started. I finished the first episode, first season a little while back, maybe about a week ago, and it was a slog. I was just being real honest with you. Is the second, third, and people who've seen this show, is the second, third, fourth season of Industry any better because of that first season? It was tough to get through. I don't like the characters. I don't think they're they're doing stupid things all the time, and they're getting away with stupid things all the time. And I just have a really hard time watching shows with characters I don't like doing things I think that are stupid that just don't make a whole lot of sense. And I just don't understand the appeal of the show. Now, my understanding and what I have heard from other people is that the first season is not nearly as good as seasons 2 and 3, and apparently season 4 is supposed to be pretty good as well. But like I said, I would like to, if it is that much better, I'm tempted to continue on with it, but man, it was tough to watch that first season of Industry. Like I said, I'm sitting there watching, and I wasn't very entertained. I didn't really see much to like from the characters we were getting. And I was just like, why is this show just so incredibly popular? Because it is. It's very popular with the folks with the people who watch it. But I just was really struggling to get behind it. So like I said, maybe I should give it season 2 and season 3, give it a shot. But as of right now, I'm just like, I just don't know that I can do this because I'm not enjoying it so far. Like I said, if you have seen it and you think it is significantly better, I would love to hear from you. So reach out to me. I know I'd love to hear your thoughts on the seasons that followed were. So, all right, guys, I appreciate all of you stopping by and pray that if you haven't followed and liked on all the social media channels that you will do so. But until next time, we'll see you then.